Welcome back. Please take your seats. Our next panel will focus on the human and the financial costs of war. Let me introduce the moderator, Gazdasági, head of the Economic Policy Center at MCC.
Thank you very much. I think that maybe Boris has made a mistake. He said that he solved the war, solved the problem, and everybody believed him. But we have a great panel. The competition is very fierce because I think we had excellent panels before, but this panel will stand the competition, in my opinion. So let me introduce the panelists. This is one of the reasons why we stand the competition. We have very good panelists. First of all, and we'll start from the seat farthest from me, Professor Zoltán Ács. Please join us. Professor Ács was teaching at the George Mason University, the London School of Economics, and right now he's a visiting fellow at MCC. The next seat is the seat of László György. László, please join us. László is a government commissioner, and he has the amazing ability to explain the most complex, most complicated economic issues in very simple terms in a very complex way. So I'm very, very happy that you have joined. The next seat is the seat of Mr. Tuomas Malinen. Please, Tuomas, join us. Tuomas is the CEO of GNS Economics from Finland. And we already had a great conversation about the euro and the impact of the war on the euro. And I'm very, very happy that you are here today as well. Tuomas has always has some fresh insights into all problems. So we are looking forward to see your opinion on the topics we'll cover today. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Mr. Gladden Pappin. And Gladden is the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and he was also teaching me how to structure an article. I think that I hope that I will make you proud today. I will structure the conversation in a good way. Thank you. So we had a lot of interesting topics covered in the previous panels, but I think that maybe not everybody knows a lot about geoeconomics or how diplomacy is working. So these aspects might be new for some of us. For me, at least, there were a lot of new things. But I think that everybody has felt the economic consequences of the war, at least if somebody is living in the region or living in Europe. As Minister Szijjártó has said, that the prices of energy, they increased a lot. So the price of gas is 7 times higher as the price of gas. The price of gas in Europe is 7 times higher as the price of gas in the US. The price of electricity is 3 times higher as the price of electricity in China. So that is one aspect, that is one impact we have felt. And another impact was the huge drop in the GDP growth forecasts. Then Chiriac had a piece, an opinion piece in the Financial Post last summer where the title of this piece was Vladimir Putin's $10 trillion war. And I wanted to start with this number, $10 trillion. It's a huge number. Unfortunately, somebody in the previous panel said that said the volume of the American defense spending, which is similar. So it actually makes this number look a little bit smaller, but this is almost 10% of the global GDP. So he argued that this war has negative impact on the global GDP, which accounts for almost 10% of the global GDP, not just for 1 year, but for several years. So let's start with the economic impact. And my first question would be that which are the most significant, the most important economic impacts, negative and if there are any positive impacts. And you can talk about the impacts, economic impacts regarding Russia and Ukraine, but you can also talk about economic impacts elsewhere in Europe, in Hungary, in Finland, or any other country. And I think let's begin with whoever wants to begin. You. Okay, thank you.
Well, we seem to have forgotten that energy is the primary input to the economy. And I think that's a reasonable starting point for discussing the negative economic impacts of both of the war and of the various responses to the war. So when the price of energy goes up, the price of manufacturing goes up. Projects, particularly in the West, that were profitable beforehand become less profitable over time. So that has obviously led to the beginnings of a decline in Western manufacturing. And unless the West finds a way through the crisis, through alternative sources of energy, or eventually reverts to purchasing cheap energy, that problem will continue. I was at the Qatar Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago, and the energy minister of Qatar pointed out that the problems in the winters are just beginning. We were fortunate to have a more mild winter this year, although it also seemed like it lasted kind of long in Budapest in the spring. But at any rate, the energy is the primary input, and when the price of energy goes up over time, deindustrialization will begin. So there are some early signs of that, and you have to even wonder if the eagerness of certain American industrial titans to go to China, even at the moment when there is considerable tension politically or geopolitically between the US and China, perhaps they have the cheaper costs there in mind as well.
That is very important and unfortunately not a positive impact for Europe. Which other impacts you can mention? And I hope for some positives as well, but you are the panelists.
Well, we'll go to the other end. So I just came from a conference last month where I was asked to talk about the economic cost of COVID, which is maybe more difficult to try to measure than the economic cost of a war. So if we just look at the direct cost, right, of what did it cost to provide bullets to this war, and the US that has provided the bulk of this money is around $50 billion. Is that a big number or is that a little number, right? And so let's compare it to the cost of the US war in Iraq and Afghanistan over 20 years. That was, I think it's $20 trillion. So this is actually a small number. It's 1 year, and so it's really not a huge number yet. Now, right? The next sort of level then is what is the cost in terms of destruction. And there, that's a much harder number to come up with because, right, what was destroyed and then what has to be rebuilt. And that number, when people start throwing that around, it's between $1 and $2 trillion. Right, and then what people usually don't discuss is the human cost, right? So if 200,000 people have been badly wounded or died, you know, how do you value human life? And yes, economists come up with numbers. And you know, the question is, did a doctor die or did an uneducated person die? And so it depends on how we value this. So the economic cost at this point of the war really are not that great. Now, the third issue that we just heard, right, and I guess energy is, right, how has this affected and what's the economic cost of the war in terms of dislocation or structural change to the world economy? You can argue it has had almost no or very little impact in the United States, and we've heard this several times today. It's had a bigger impact in Europe, especially on the largest European economy, which is Germany, and it's also had an economic impact right on Ukraine and Russia, and there's been an impact on other countries or globally, certainly in terms of both energy and grain exports that have been disrupted around the world. So the economic impact of this at the moment are not that great, but we're only into this 1 year. And if this drags on for 5 years, the numbers start becoming significant. But as we saw in Iran and Iraq war, the 1 year numbers are not that great. If you do this for 20 years, the numbers start becoming much larger.
Thank you very much. So loss of competition, loss of human lives, loss of infrastructure. What else? Or are there any specific impacts on Finland or Hungary which you can mention?
Yeah, I think that is mine. Yeah, I would say Finland is the same as almost all European countries. So the food price inflation is out of hand. So that's the major thing. But in general, like the war has affected on inflation, but it's not its primary driver, or it hasn't been. So if you want to think where the inflation comes from, this is actually the inflation of Christian Lagarde, Jay Powell, Joe Biden, and then Mr. Putin, and maybe Zelensky, depending on how you see the war starting. But it's like so much like blame has been placed on the warring parties, on all kinds of macroeconomic imbalances, which also are just a reflection of a imbalances that have grown for a longer time. And so the 10 trillion figure is, well, I can shake another one from my sleeve. So it's just that. But on the positive note, I noticed myself thinking that why why did I once again not buy the stocks of Rayon or all these things that build this military hardware, because the European arsenal has been depleted, so we need to rebuild, and at some point Ukraine needs to be rebuilt, so that's an investment. The world economy basically rose from the Great Depression through the Second World War. So, okay, this is a kind of a sarcastic notion, but still, there is the flip side of all of this. So there will be wars always change both our thinking and how our economies work. So there's always something good in it too, albeit it's a very gruesome, human toll. It's related to them.
Yeah, I totally understand. I totally agree with you that every unfortunate distraction is the opportunity for future rebuilding and investments, which can compensate for loss of GDP, loss of employment in the present terms. Are there any other positive or negative consequences, or if you focus on Hungary, are there any consequences which were not mentioned yet, Mr. Commissioner?
Thank you very much for the question. First, the title of the panel is Economic Impacts, Human and Financial Costs. And first, I will have to say that the human costs are unmeasurable for me. So the human lives that we are losing in a war is always unmeasurable. So I'm telling it first because we are talking about the economic impacts of a war where people are dying, and we seem like cube-headed economists, and I wanted to wanted to add this sentence. Second, Hungary already suffered, so to say, around, you mentioned $10 trillion war, 10% of the global GDP. Hungary suffered 4.6% of its GDP growth. There is a German Economic Research Institute which had a methodology for Germany. Macronomy Institute in Hungary made the same calculation, forecast for Hungary for 2023, and the growth loss of Hungary is 4.6% in 2022 and 2023 altogether. And Professor Ács just mentioned that let's imagine that this war lasts a few more years, and he talked about the rebuilding costs. And also, we can also see that European Union member states are spending or announced 700 billion euro energy support subsidies, energy subsidies around Europe for last 1.5 years. That's 4% of the European GDP. So we are really suffering and we are really losing, and through the inflation, people can feel it on their skin as well. This was the second or third time that you mentioned it. Let's talk about the advantages also which stem from this war. Well, it's again a little bit sarcastic when we are talking about any advantages, if we may, but it sped up the energy independence efforts of Europe and greening of Europe. Well, but what is the price of it? So there was a 2 times energy price difference between the United States, and a twofold difference between the energy prices in the United States and in Europe. It increased to 5 to 6 times at an average last year, and it will consolidate back to 3-4 times difference, which is a huge difference. The European companies are just pricing out from the global markets and from Europe as well. Maybe I'm talking a little bit too long, but here just one last more sentence. I just talked recently a Hungarian large company which produces milk and milk products. And they told us that China is a milk importer, and they imported milk until recently from Europe, and now they replaced the European import by American import. So there is a decoupling, there is a pressure from the United States on China, and the United States is benefiting from the perspective how Europe, the European Union relates to the Ukrainian and Russian war. It's ridiculous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner Tovas.
Yeah, I can actually, this is a Finnish example. Like we have lived alongside with Russia for a long time, and we know how to handle them. And, you know, ever since well, basically when a Finn is able to speak, he or she can tell you that do not relinquish your independence to the Russians in any shape or form. And this is what Germans did. So I would say that the problems in the energy markets in Europe saved only by the exceptionally mild winter we had, were just caused by the stupid solutions they made before, which came problems now. So you do not trust Russia unilaterally to handle things. That's the stupidest thing ever. And it's just, it reflects kind of the naivety that has taken over Europe for the past 20, 30 years maybe. And this has like woken up us from that. And the other thing about the US, if you think, for example, their LNG sales are off the charts. And how do you get to that? Well, you start a war against one of the prominent providers of gas to Europe, and then you blow up their pipeline.
You know, I think we need to take a step back just a bit and separate the energy from the war. The Russians didn't cut off energy. They didn't stop exporting, right? Europeans basically made this a policy. And I'm not saying it was a good or a bad policy, and there was American pressure too, and I understand all that, but this was a deliberate policy carried out systematically over a year to cut energy from Russia, knowing that this was going to have a negative effect on both your industry, on your consumers' budgets, on food, and everything else. So this is in some sense self-imposed. The second point is that someone is getting rich off energy because someone now was selling gasoline that was $4 a gallon now for $8, and whether it's oil companies, whether it's other countries, or whether it's the United States oil companies. So even though Europe may be suffering from a global perspective, higher energy prices have also made some people rich while it has made other people poorer, right? And in war, there's always some people benefit from it, some people lose. So when you try to think of the overall cost of this, you can't just look at one side of the equation that energy is more expensive in Europe. This has put money into the coffers of other places, and then on balance, it's probably not as bad as we think it is.
So we actually get back to the culprits I really like, European leaders or the European Union leaders for this. Fair point.
And I think that it was very, very good that we talked about this as well, because there are human sufferings and human lives which we cannot really measure. So some costs are extremely high, for sure. But if every country or every company would only have costs, I think that this war would end tomorrow. So I think it's very important to see that, as you have enlightened us, there are always players which might benefit from a situation like that. And I think that maybe these players are hindering the process of getting to peace. But it's important to see who are the players who are not necessarily motivated to make the right steps to reach peace. Multiple of you have mentioned the length or the probable length of this conflict, that it might be a long conflict. You talked about the annual costs, or we can also talk about daily cost of the war. And if we look at these numbers, then the perspective or the chance that this conflict can last for longer, it's very frightening for me. I'm curious whether you think there is, so what do you think, how long this conflict can last? And if we look at the opening panel of GlobeSec, then the former US Secretary of Defense said that we have to prepare for decades-long conflict. So do you agree with this statement? Do you agree that this might take decades to solve? Or are you more optimistic, or are you even more pessimistic than this statement? If you have a strong opinion.
Well, I have one. Now that Finland is included in the NATO, I think this conflict will end more quickly than in 10 years, because that's an escalation towards Russia, massive escalation. We were independent for a long time and neutral, and now we're not. So Russia is kind of, boxed in now, and it's not looking good.
Thank you.
There was a famous American baseball player named Yogi Berra in the 1950s. And they were in the World Series. And the reporter came up to him and said, "Yogi, are you going to win the World Series?" And Yogi Berra said, making predictions is really hard, especially about the future. And I think that's where we are with this war. Look, we had a Cold War with Russia for 30 years, right? And the day before the Berlin Wall came down, someone asked me, "How long will this wall last?" I said, "I don't know, maybe 100 years. Next day it was down. And so this conflict, which, if we think of this, yes, this war started in 2014, but this ongoing security issue with Russia has been going on since the Second World War. So this issue really hasn't been solved, and we went from a Cold War then to a warm peace, now to an active war, and this can go on for a very long time. None of us know. But I think there's a silver lining in this, right? There are costs, and then there are benefits of the war, which people don't talk about. So I had a colleague in Maryland named Manker Olson, who was one of the smartest economists of his generation, and he wrote a book called The Rise and Decline of Nations. And what he was interested in was why Germany and Japan, by the 1960s, were again world leaders after having been defeated in war and then have had difficult times before the war. And the answer he gave was very simple. He says, war destroys the institutions that had impeded progress, right? It was a theory of collective action. And Germany and Japan rebuilt their institutions to basically make it possible for their economies to be successful. So my question then is, and it's an observation and a question, maybe this war will finally change the institutions that have sort of bedeviled Europe for the last 70 years, and we'll be able to come up with a security agreement and put an end to this finally, and we change the institutions in Russia, in Ukraine, and to some extent in Europe. So to me, that's the positive side of this. If we can get to that, we may be able to solve this lingering problem of 70 years once and for all.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Commissioner, and then Thomas.
I don't want to underestimate the intellectual capabilities of baseball players, but Yogi Bear stole this saying from Niels Bohr. So, but Niels Bohr's brother was a goalkeeper. So, but it was first quoted from Niels Bohr. But back to your question, I wouldn't be able to predict how long this conflict lasts. But the question is, how do we approach it? And how do we approach it will determine the effects on us. So I don't want to be political, but it can be backed by statistics that the sanctions that Europe, the European Union, levied on Russia affects us much more badly than Russia. So everybody expected that Russia will collapse, the Russian economy will collapse. The Russian trade surplus skyrocketed last year because of the high prices. The apologists of, or how you say, of the sanctions say that, yeah, later on they will have their effects, but we don't see these later on effects because they could channel their exports towards India, towards China, and the European Union, with high leverage, is importing energy from all other locations of the world. And the McKinsey made a calculation how much Europe spent on energy, on gas, coal, and oil in 2021. It was 700 billion euros, and in 2022 it was 1,800 billion euros. This 1,100 billion euros difference burdens the European economy and the European households. That's huge amount. That is more than 6% of the European GDP. I forgot to say that we spend on education in the OECD, in the developed economies, around 4.55% of the GDP. Just to imagine how big is the loss, the growth loss that Hungary, that Europe is losing, and how big is the bill that we are paying for the higher energy prices. And it is only because of our decisions. And you mentioned that it's not wise to be dependent from Russia. From a Finnish and from a Hungarian perspective, we are small countries and close to Russia. That's true. From a German perspective, our bargaining power is much different than the bargaining power of Germany. and actually they just by their own, from their own will, they just destroyed one of the pillars of their competitiveness and one of the pillar of the European competitiveness by levying these sanctions.
It's so true. Just one sentence, and then Thomas, and then Gladden. You have mentioned that there was an expectation that the Russian economy will collapse, and I was looking at the most recent GDP figures a few weeks ago, and there were 3 European countries, 2 Baltic one, and maybe Luxembourg was the third one, I don't remember exactly, which were having smaller or more negative GDP growth rates than Russia. So I think that it's amazing, and it's also sad that, yeah, exactly, we thought that the sanctions will punish Russia, but actually it seems that some countries are punished more than the country we wanted to punish.
And sorry, I just didn't conclude, but the conclusion is that we have to stop these sanctions which are hurting us more than the Russians, and we have to find some other solution that might hurt those who invaded us.
So true, so true.
Go ahead.
Thomas, and then Gladden, and then Professor.
Yeah, I fully agree. Sanctions are not, reasonable. But my dear man, do not tell that you don't want to be political. You work for the government. Just carry it with pride, I work for a very small group of partners, and still I'm political. Everyone is political nowadays. But about that. But I want to make one notion just came to mind about the red lines and the timing of the crisis, or how long it may last. My American friend told me a few months ago that if Mexico would be joining a military alliance with Russia, and it would be selling Texas, there would be no Mexico no more. So there is a certain red line over which you push a state that considers at least herself as a major power, and then things happen like that. So, well, we'll see how it goes. But the thing is that, like in 2014, I was very highly for the sanctions against Russia. I was, let's show them, because, well, I didn't know enough about the conflict, and we're Finns, and when Russian, attacks, we are like, kind of, understandable. But then after a year, I thought, no, this is completely wrong policy, because Russia, like the Soviet Union before, it has a uncanny ability to rise from any kind of hardship, like Napoleon was on the, the ports of Moscow, so was Hitler, and they came back, and all the economic hardship, they just sprung back up. So, and then it came to me that it's much more safer for everyone to have an integrated Russia than an isolated Russia. And that's the big mistake our politicians made, for example, at the European level, that they made the sanctions to isolate Russia, to make it more independent, and in that case, more dangerous. So that was a massive mistake.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Gladden, but I also would like to bring a new question to the discussion table, which is Professor was talking about the destruction of institutions, and I think that one institution which might be harmed during the current situation is the US dollar, because when they were seizing the savings of the Russian central bank, I think that was a very negative signal for a lot of central banks which were hanging on to US dollars as reserves. So I'm very interested in what you wanted to say, but if you wish, you can also discuss what is your opinion on the impact of the conflict, impact of the handling of the conflict on the strength or the position of the US dollar.
Well, I have to say, first of all, that I'm not an economist, and therefore I see things only politically, and I think it's not in the partisan respect, but in the sense that we have to make a judgment about what is good for the whole, and so I can't follow this economic way of saying, well, on the one hand there are some winners, and on the other hand there are some losers, and maybe there will be some winners, because I see the situation as having no winners at all. And I think no powers are really happy about this situation. Of course, there are opportunistic people and even powers that are trying to take advantage of the situation, but it's not a good situation in which to have to take advantage. So, and I think what you mentioned is an important context for evaluating this. So maybe there are some oligarchs in the West who are profiting personally, or oligarchs elsewhere who are profiting personally from the repositioning and shifts of industry in the course of this conflict. But there are, it seems to me, again, speaking from a political perspective, that there are a lot of consequences of the war that will take a long time to play out. At American Affairs, which is the journal that I co-edit, in March of last year, we published an article arguing that de-dollarization was a phenomenon that would begin, because in some sense the supremacy of the US dollar, which is a key element of American prosperity and also Western prosperity as a whole, is based on trust that US and Anglo-American financial technology offers a neutral and safe place for other countries to store their money. And suddenly that assumption was violated. And so, when I have no idea, to go back to the earlier question, I have no idea how long the war will last, but I think that the consequences of the war are only beginning and will take a very long time to play out. There have been a lot of small movements toward settling transactions outside of the dollar. Brazil and Argentina were teasing the possibility of a currency arrangement. And there have been a lot of other phenomena like that. And if that happens, then there may be some people on the economic ledger who are up or down in the West, but the trajectory would be going down. And so I think we need to take full consideration of that context as well.
Let me follow up on that. So here's the question. Did the Second World War make the world a better place or a worse place? That's a serious question. And let's assume that the First World War made the world a worse place. And the question then, if this is a peace conference that we're having here, the question really is not about whether the war makes us better off or worse off afterwards. The question is, what will be the architecture of the peace? And that is what's going to determine what the world looks like after this. So let me talk about John Maynard Keynes, right, the great British economist, wrote a book after the First World War called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, right? It was a bad peace full of reparations, punishment, and the world ended up much worse off. We ended up with inflation, recession, the rise of fascism, and the Second World War. After the Second World War, we put into place organizations, global organizations, structures that made the world a much better place, and we had 70 years, more or less, of progress. So the question for me is, what will the structure of the peace look like? Is it going to be punitive and destructive, or are we going to try to adjust these institutions, build new ones? And I don't know whether that means bringing Russia back into the European fold or some other structure, I don't know. But to me, that is the real interesting question. How do we start thinking about that? And look, we can end up with the Korean situation, which was bad, or we can end up with the Vietnam situation where that was beneficial. And so I think this is the question that we should be trying to contemplate on the human and financial costs of this. We want to come out of this in a way that we minimize the human and financial costs coming out of this, and make Europe a safer and more prosperous place.
Thank you very much. One very important financial cost, which was mentioned several times, is inflation. We saw that inflation levels rose at the end of 2020. The Baltic states were having zero or even negative inflation in some cases. And then at the end of 2022, it went higher than 20%. In Greece, in Ireland as well, inflation levels were negative at the end of 2020, and then they were around 10% at the end of 2022. Already inflation figures started to decrease, but my question is, what do you think? Will inflation figures go back to the pre-war and I would say pre-COVID level, where we had very, very low inflation levels around 0%, 0.1% on average? Or will they decrease but stay at a comparably higher level than before?
Well, considering that the structure of the world is likely to be multipolar after this, we don't of course know, but it's a possibility, then we have to take into account that the supply chains will come shorter, meaning that you will do stuff at home, which will then increase the costs and will put the inflation possibly on a higher trend in a longer term. But what we are now looking at is a possibility of a massive deflationary shock from a banking crisis which started September, October past year. I think I warned on it here, I guess. Yeah, and it will likely to get worse, much worse. So then we get a credit crunch, maybe even a credit depression and massive deflation, and then we'll see. But these episodes, like the Great Depression, which was just basically a major global financial crisis, and the Second World War, they do come in packs, and then there was the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. So there is we have to include the possibility that there will be a series of shocks that are still coming, and the next winter will show us how the European energy markets cope, I'm sure.
Well, you know, my students ask me about inflation. I always give them the proper answer. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Basic textbook definition. And the inflation wasn't started or caused by the Ukraine war, right? This started during the COVID years as governments pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. I understand why it was done, right? Both monetary and fiscal policy. And the economists told us, the ones that didn't remember inflation, it's okay, we haven't had inflation for 15 years, nothing will happen. Well, those of us that had a longer memory said, no, this will kick in. And other people would, and sure enough, right, inflation went up less in the US, more in Europe. So until we pull that money back out, cut back on fiscal stimulus, inflation won't go away. The second point I think it's important to keep in mind, rising energy prices are not inflation, right? That's a change in relative prices. One price goes up, and yes, it may affect the price index, but that's not really inflation. Soon as that energy stabilizes or comes down, that will dissipate. And the final point, and I don't know this because I don't study European energy markets, but has Europe diversified its energy sources so that it can now live without Russian energy? I don't know that, right?
I think not is the answer. Not completely.
Not completely.
Parts. Yeah.
If I may, yes, if the prices are not sticky, but the prices are normally sticky. So even if inflation consolidates, that means that the prices stay high up there. if there is perfect competition or close to perfect competition, then might be some decreases in prices as well. But yes, too much money chasing too few goods. But if from the other side, too few goods offered against.
Well, no, but that's what happened, right? That's what COVID did.
That's what
COVID basically disrupted. You know, people stayed home from the factory, and the government gave them money, so we all went out and wanted a new car, and the Germans didn't make any. You know, so you couldn't get a car,
Exactly.
so we raised the price of the existing ones.
And the governments shut us down
That's right.
first.
No.
So they did it.
Yeah, no,
not
that's
the
right.
warriors, the governments.
What I'm saying that 90% of the economists recently in the last 2 years approached inflation, that there was a huge, too big fiscal stimulus. Here in Hungary, there was no big fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus was on a supply side. So we gave companies, we gave companies CapEx subsidies, capital expenditure subsidies, if they did not postpone their investments and they kept their workers. And we didn't give aid to the people or compensations like in the United States. And these compensations in the United States very quickly just were washed out by higher prices. So I believe that the disruption of the world economy through COVID, the disruption of the world economy through the efforts decoupling China, the disruption of the world economy through the sanctions as an answer to the Ukrainian-Russian war, these are causing supply side problems.
Yeah.
So if the high inflation is caused by high energy prices, well, let's get back. Where there's no inflation, what happened in the last decade before the COVID hit, before the COVID burst? Cheap money, cheap energy, cheap production from China. Cheap production from China will not come back. Cheap money will come back when inflation is reduced. Cheap energy in Europe will not come back. And we also believe that digitalization makes our world more efficient, but digitalization and automation and robotization needs huge capital expenditure, demands huge investments, which also means that the level of price increase in the future, in the next decade or the next decades, even if this very high inflation will consolidate, there will be a much higher level of inflation than before in the last decade.
I completely agree with the Commissioner's analysis in there, and I was just going to add a political perspective, which is that we seem to have forgotten what is required for a functioning global economy. We have had several chances to learn what it requires in terms of having, open markets, good connections, reliable supply chains that are not constantly disrupted, causing producers to have to reevaluate their production from scratch. So the situation in COVID was not simply that there was massive government expenditures, but also that supply chains suddenly ground to a halt. So on the production side, it was impossible to find components. You had to find them from more expensive places. And basically, you could say that in some sense, this modern economic world which we built, it's an extremely complicated, extremely delicate entity, and we threw a spanner into the works, or COVID threw itself into the works, however you want to think about it. And now that's happening again, and of course it could be an important policy decision. We could make an important policy decision to do this with full recognition of what the consequences are because of some particular goal. But that's not how it happened. We said this is the one thing necessary to cut off the Russian invasion right at the beginning, and this will be effective. And instead, we've thrown an even bigger spanner into the works, and it's going to be very, very hard to put the system back together again. The system relied upon last-minute delivery of components, producers stocking nothing, but having everything on time, purchasers in the manufacturing sector having a huge array of sources from which they could put together their just-in-time delivery in order to make their production. And all of that got exploded without even mentioning the cost of energy. So whether we call that inflation or a really, really sticky long-term increase in relative prices, it's bad.
Yeah, it just appeared to me you two are going to love this. So the corona shock, the inflation, the war, what is the single denominator behind all these crises? Anyone? Denominator or factor? Single factor, everything, yeah. Well, you could say that. It's the government. So let's get rid of the government and fix our problems. Applause. There are a few capitalists here. You're a government scum.
So, the May IMF meetings in Washington, right, where all the smart bankers come and central bankers and everything, the IMF put out a position paper on the future of globalization. And they basically measured the amount of globalization by the share of exports and imports as a percentage of GDP. And since the Second World War, that integration has been rising, leading to more productivity, more growth. Since '89, it was also rising. It stopped rising in 2010 after the financial crisis. So since 2010, the integration has been flat. Even though we hadn't felt it as much, it has been. And they predicted that unless we get away from the fragmentation and the global conflicts, they predicted about a 7% decline in exports and imports over the next decade, which is a huge number. And of course, they couldn't figure out what should be done, but these are forces right beyond. They may be exacerbated by COVID and the war, but there's also other issues driving it, the conflict with China, or the rise of other countries. So we may be in this period where we're not going to get back, independent of the war, I always think of, the last 20 years was really good years, until Trump came, whether he caused it or not, but right around 2015, the world started changing, and we had COVID and the war and everything else, but the underlying continued integration had already slowed down.
I think it was Max Verstappen who started to win the Formula One races, and then everything just, you told Trump, you told the government, let's blame it on Verstappen, sorry.
We have very little time. We had great questions from the audience. I want to include one because it was mentioned that inflation is coming from too much money chasing too few goods. You also have mentioned the reasons for, probably reasons for the higher than before inflation levels on the long run. And here was a very innovative solution from one of our audience members who wrote that the US has wasted trillions of dollars for fighting wars over the past 30 years. Why are they not investing that in infrastructure? They said at home, but do you think that this is a way which countries can try to spend less on military and more on infrastructure or production in the recent environment, or is this a dream? What is your opinion?
Well, who makes wars? Governments. So once again, get rid of the government and
maybe Verstappen.
It's possible that private corporations have a stake in this too, I think. But yes, I mean the U.S. has had a great difficulty in formulating a pro-manufacturing industrial policy. As David P. Goldman had pointed out, who's been here for the last couple of days, the U.S. has had an industrial policy for the last 20 years. It has been one of offshoring its manufacturing and attempting to shift to a service-based and soft economy, putting the manufacturing elsewhere. On the positive side, out of the current situation, I'm not as optimistic that it will lead to a great World War II-like reindustrialization in the U.S., but there have been a couple of efforts in that direction. Unfortunately, again, not super well executed. We have the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. that was passed last fall, and it's almost one of the only attempts at having an industrial policy in the United States that's oriented toward manufacturing. There are a lot of manufacturing subsidies for semiconductor chip manufacturers, et cetera. However, by a 6-to-1 margin, subsidies are provided for clean energy projects, and most of those are directed to their destinations by the newly powerful green energy lobby in Washington. So unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be hard for the U.S. to formulate that.
The government.
You know, I would add something to this debate following that up. Everybody thinks that we have to shift to green energy, okay? And then everybody assumes that it's costless. And we've never in history had to de-invest from how many trillions of dollars of investment in fossil fuels and then reinvest let's say a similar amount in green energy. That is not going to have a positive impact on the economy for decades. Because we're writing off, it's like taking your house and taking half of it and burning it down. You have half a house now, and then you got to rebuild the other half. So doesn't mean you have to do this, but this is not going to be pretty. You know, you can think of it as divorce, right? You divorce your wife, marry a new woman, and you have to now pay for both. You know, that's really where we are.
By answering the question, I would like to go back to what Professor Ács said, that the question is how the architecture of peace will look like. And while the European Union is hesitating and planning to invest 300 billion into Africa, in the last 15 years, or the last 10 years, since the Belt and Road Initiative from China started, China invested into Africa 1,000 billion US dollars. According to some estimates, it's rather 2,000 than 1,000. And we are talking about Europe is planning, and China already did it into infrastructure, into natural resources, into mines, etc., into connectivity. And well, since the war started, China made Saudi Arabia and Iran to sit into one table to negotiate and start diplomatic relations. And they are using this conflict to show that they can contribute to the peace, or they can contribute to the architecture of peace after the Ukrainian-Russian war. And we see that the defense expenditures, the defense budgets are increasing all around the world, in Europe, in the United States, in China as well. So I'm not saying that they are just simply peaceful, and I'm not a proponent of China here. But we have to see that from a multipolar world, what kind of new architecture of the world economy and the world politics can stem from. So I try to see the positive side as well. Sorry, and I try to be optimistic as much as I can, and as much as governments and politicians can contribute to the new architecture of peace.
Thank you very much. It was a very good closing word in my opinion. The architecture of peace is very important. The architecture of a panel is also important. I think that this panel was having a great architecture. I thank you very much for Professor, for Commissioner, for Thomas, for Gladden, for joining us and sharing their thoughts about the economic impact of the war. And please give a big hand to the panel.